With a show as popular as Adventure Time and a land as vast as Ooh, it's not surprising that we'd eventually get another spin-off of the series. What is surprising is the focus of the spin-off being the gender-bent version of the main characters, Fionna and Cake. With news of the spin-off presumably coming out sometime soon, I thought now would be the perfect time to go back and take another look at the 5.5-ish episodes about the pair and see what the spin-off could possibly take or improve upon the original. Anyway, obligatory spoiler alert aside, let's go ahead and jump into the titular episode. Leaving any of the setup until the end, the first episode launches us straight into the Fionna and Cake universe and immediately introduces us to Prince Gumball as well. The three characters in this opening scene are all at least relatively similar to their gender-bent counterparts, but to varying levels. Fionna sounds and acts just like a female Finn, albeit aged up a bit to mitigate some of the creepiness. Same thing with Prince Gumball, although he's perhaps aged down a bit so that he and Fionna can be attracted to one another without the age gap that plagues Finn and PB. Both of these characters match their respective original characters' voice pattern really well, which definitely helps sell the gender-bent idea the show is going for. Finally, we have Cake, who while I mostly like as a character, it's a pretty liberal interpretation of what a female Jake might look like. I get that just turning Jake into a girl would feel a bit off, but Cake is perhaps a bit too far in the other direction. Either way, the interaction between these three all feel natural, and most of the jokes feel like they could fit in even if these were just the normal characters. The introduction of Ice King into this one and the way that she acts does have some weird implications with the reveal of who's telling the story at the end of the episode, but moving past that, she's basically just a younger Ice King, but female and less goofy. Still, some solid jokes and action sequences with this section as we transition into the main course of the episode, the PG and Fionna date. There's a lot to like about this scene, such as the fantastically named Lord Monochromacorn and the beautifully animated backgrounds in the meadows, but the episode really hits its climax when all four characters take to the skies. PG's song is admittedly intentionally corny, but sonically really solid, and the colors and backgrounds work fantastically well here with the music. The choreography to have Fionna fighting while she sings is a great solution to not just have Fionna sit there, and the animation feels really smooth throughout. The dialogue after is just a perfect blend of Adventure Time weirdness and the romantic tone this episode really wants to have, and it acts as a nice transition to the final act of the episode at the ball. It's a nice touch for the show to go out of its way to make more gender-bent characters than it really had to fill out the ball, and it makes the world feel like an actual place. After an insinuation that I'm surprised the show was allowed to go for, the scene in Gumball's bedroom does a really good job fitting a good action scene into this episode, as after the first twist, the fight between Ice Queen and Fionna has some pretty nice shots in it, and does a better job utilizing ice powers in an action sequence than a majority of the regular series. Fionna and Cake suddenly starting to pine for Ice King is really funny, and so is Finn's reaction to the story at the end of the episode, but the twist itself that the whole thing is just an Ice King fanfiction feels like it's neutering some of the potential that Fionna and Cake had, and it's definitely an odd direction for this episode to take that feels like they didn't intend doing 4 more of these. Overall, while this episode's plot is intentionally as simple as possible to keep the entire focus on the fun gender-bent versions of the characters, it's still thoroughly enjoyable to watch as a fan of the series, and it sets up loads of potential for follow-up episodes, while also giving them the challenge of dealing with the whole fanfiction thing. Before getting to the next episode, I wanted to quickly go over the half episode I mentioned before, Mystery Dungeon. No, not that Mystery Dungeon, this Mystery Dungeon, which while it is technically about Ice King trying to bring Fionna and Cake to life, he doesn't mention this goal until the end of the episode, and he ends up only bringing the physical book itself to life, so I didn't really think it was worth fully diving into for this episode. I will say though, it is a really funny episode with some surprisingly well done animation, as well as having this short but cursed Nepter-voiced Fionna dream sequence.
Dreams are real!
So I still think it's worth checking out. Either way, I think we can go ahead and jump into the next full Fionna and Cake episode, Bad Little Boy.
Bad little boy, that's what you're acting like, I really don't buy.
The episode starts off with a scene that's pretty clearly written by Ice King, which is a bit of an odd line in the sand to draw within a few minutes, especially with what's coming up, but nonetheless, the opening scene is really stinking funny. If you can get past Dr. Prince being voiced by a Tom Kenny literally just doing his Simon voice, there's a bunch of great gags here. Watching the girls pine over Ice King is done better here too, and it ends up being a scene that, while perhaps does take a little bit too much time from the main story, is simply funny enough to justify its place. The scene back at the Ice Kingdom has some great gags too, and the princesses just thrashing Ice King's fanfiction is surprisingly funny despite being pretty predictable. Marceline's in this episode too, and it's nice to see her and Ice King interact in an episode that's not so depressing. Their dynamic when the episode is not about their tragic past is still worth exploring comedically, and having Marceline be the one to tell the story is a nice way to get around Ice King not having a self-insert. It does make it a bit weird that Marcy's story is about the gender-bent version of herself being in love with female Finn, but if you can get past that, then you'll get to watch peak Fionna and Cake. The opening scene of the story in the treehouse does a good job in showing how Fionna has become somewhat disillusioned with the prince, and explains why she might be more willing to become adventurous with Marshall. Speaking of which, Marshall Lee matches what one would imagine Marceline would see the gender-bent version of herself to be exactly, with Donald Glover taking the character to a really fun place. I kinda wish we got to see more of Gumball and Marshall interacting, especially since they got Neil Patrick Harris to return for one final time, but it gives us plenty of time at the party for one of the most iconic scenes really in the entire series. Besides the fact that the show somehow got Lumpy Space Prince grinding past the censors, the centerpiece of this scene and the episode is the impeccably well-written, animated, sung, and scored duet between Fionna and Marshall Lee, while Kate gives some nice comedic relief in the middle. Just some ridiculously good choreography here, as the scene just feels so expressive and innovative throughout the entire thing. This scene's probably in my top 5 of the series, it's just so stinking good. We do have to move past it eventually though, as Marshall Lee pushing Cake out of jealousy before kidnapping her feels like genuine teenage guy shenanigans, and besides just fulfilling the divine need to have Childish Gambino rap if he's gonna voice a character, the scene in the graveyard has some great action sequences for being such a short scene. The ending of this one, at least the ending of the Fionna and Cake stuff, is really stinking well done too, with Marshall Lee's need to be idolized being matched by Fiona's realness in a scene that's true to both Marceline and Finn's character, but in a way that can never actually be done with the original characters, and man, I love this episode. I even love it enough to get over the strange reveal at the end of this one that Ice King has a giant shrine to Fionna and Cake. Overall, this episode is one of my favorites in the entire series, and is definitely my favorite of the gender-bent ones. Just fantastic character chemistry between every single character in this one, as they manage to both capitalize on already having the established character traits of the original characters, and are able to tell original stories because of the gender swap and the elimination of the age gap. Truly terrific stuff, and perhaps the best you could possibly do with Fionna and Cake in this format, even if it could have benefited from having closer to the full 11 minutes. Either way, let's go ahead and see if the next episode can match its quality, The Prince Who Wanted Everything.
That's all I need, that's all I need.
This episode certainly is something. We start off with a much shorter setup scene than last time, where Ice King quickly discovers that he's been kidnapped by LSP and forced to read her fanfiction of his fanfiction. Besides just having a pretty nice background, this scene really never manages to strike anything funny, and mostly just exists to set up the idea that LSP is the one who's telling the story. And yeah, more so than any of the other main tales, that's pretty evident here, as this episode is more of a Lumpy Space Prince episode than a Fionna and Cake episode, as the latter characters are hardly in it, and when they are, they're hardly the same characters. And that's the biggest problem this episode runs into. It constantly begs to be compared to the episodes before it, and those comparisons are never positive. Is it a fun idea to have LSP write a story about who she thinks she is? Sure, but this episode has no real reason to do the gender bent angle again, and it just results in LSP, Lumpy Space Prince that is, being such an insufferable character to follow around. It's an entire episode built around the gimmick of, haha, isn't it funny that Lumpy Space Princess doesn't think she sucks as much as she actually does? And then they made it into a Fionna and Cake episode without any real reason to. Seriously, Fionna and Cake don't even show show up until halfway through, and until that point, this could have just been an LSP fanfiction where she imagines herself as a character that people listen to. There are some admittedly fun gags spread throughout the latter half of this one. Fionna and Cake bobbing up and down during the song cracks me up every time for no reason, and the song itself is fun despite being pretty void of any sonic value, but the rest of the episode kind of just makes me want to bash my head against the wall until I wake up in a world where this video was only about the first 2 Fionna and Cake episodes. But since we're here, let's go ahead and talk about the end of this one, which, while I guess it does have some fairly impressive animation, ends as obviously as it started, with LSP just screaming "I don't care" until the episode ends and the show pretends that it invented the idea of being anti-moral. What really bugs me about this episode is that where the first 2 episodes were intentionally cheesy in a "this is cheesy and you'll still love it" kind of way, this one's intentionally cheesy in a "this episode is intentionally poorly written so you can't complain about it" kind of way. Maybe I'm just extra grumpy because this episode is a follow-up to the one that I love so much, but I really can't recommend watching this one unless you really want to see a surprisingly well-animated rabid possum go into Ice King's crotch. Anyway, it can't get any worse, so let's just go ahead and jump into the next episode, 5 Short Tables, with as much hope as we can muster.
Sorry, Cake, but these just look like formless blobs of sweet flapjack to me.
So this episode is a spin-off of the regular Adventure Time Grables, which are generally a collection of 5 stories that connect together by a vague theme. And that's exactly what we get this time around, but in the Fionna and Cake universe. Before getting to that though, this episode starts off with the Ice King discovering that his fanfiction is being messed with, taping it back together, and then reading it to his penguins. Seriously, that's it. It's definitely the shortest amount of time spent not doing Fionna and Cake in any of these since the first episode, but it's appreciated to give as much time as possible to the actual tables. The first story of this episode, and the one that connects every other story, starts off with Cake cooking flapjacks for Fionna and wanting to create flapjacks that tells a story. Besides just being a really cute opener, this scene also establishes something else in this one, which is that we're back to just regular old Fionna and Cake. Does it really make any sense that Ice King is back to writing gender-bent stories that make sense and don't involve him as a self-insert? Not really, but the plot hole is worth having the old Fionna and Cake back. Anyway, back to Cake making flapjacks. It's nice to just see Fionna and Cake talk to each other, even if there's nothing inherently funny or impressive about it. The 2 characters set off to travel around Ooh and look for flapjack inspiration, first landing at the Candy Kingdom, where we meet a seemingly brand new Prince Gumball, complete with a new voice actor. Seriously, in this episode, Fionna and Cake become even more like Finn and Jake, while Gumball completely deviates, becoming a pretty unrecognizable character. Trying to imagine this scene happening between Peppermint Butler and Princess Bubblegum just doesn't work, but if you ignore that, this scene is still pretty funny at least. Watching Butterscotch Butler target PGs into securities makes for a fairly humorous and entertaining scene, and given that this is one of 5 vignettes, it doesn't really have enough time to bore. I definitely wish they would have gotten some actual Gumball and Marshall interaction instead of just references to their past relationship, but hey, this is a nice send-off to the character, just not a send-off to the Prince Gumball of previous episodes. Next up is an unexpected romantic Turtle and Flame Prince interaction, which is fun but odd. I genuinely don't get how or why this is here, but hey, watching Turtle Prince have to awkwardly balance his devotion to the books and his devotion to his job helping patrons, while Flame Prince, who's somehow voiced by Hannibal Buress, accidentally reenacts Fahrenheit 451 while just wanting to pee, makes for a somewhat slow but conceptually fun romp. Probably my least favorite of the bunch though. LSP and Marshall Lee have a nice tale too, with some great animation and just general low-key atmosphere. LSP is significantly less annoying here than before, and seeing Marshall be somewhat benevolent is a fun side of the character that more accurately mirrors the Marceline in the later seasons. This is a character dynamic that works really well comedically and is an actual solid send-off to these guys. The last table has to be my favorite though, with Ice Queen taking us 3 fanfictions deep in a really fun return to her character. Her being completely different than Ice King is continued here, and while I wish that her character had changed a little bit to reflect the friendlier Ice King of the latter half of the series, her fight with Fionna gives this episode somewhat of an action sequence, and her use of the flapjack sword helps wrap up the first story, perfectly linking the whole thing together. Ice King connecting all the stories together through their relation to tables fully completes this episode's destiny as the show's parody of its own Grables, and I'm glad that we don't have to have a big reveal at the end of this one of Ice King having an even bigger Fionna and Cake shrine or something. Overall, this episode serves as a nice send-off to the entire gender-bent kingdom and a very straightforward presentation of tales. While its lack of focus prevents it from reaching the highs of the first 2 episodes, it's nice and inoffensive, and a decent last regular hoorah for Fionna and Cake. Anyway, only 1 episode left, the awkwardly named Fionna and Cake and Fionna.
I know, because I am Fionna!
And here we are at the most confusing episode of all, and also the one that's probably most important in predicting the spinoff. Despite getting the full-fledged Fionna and Cake intro and everything, this episode actually starts with Finn and Jake just doing classic Finn and Jake things before being drawn into Ice King's fanfiction reading. I love all the citizens of Ooo trying to be as supportive as possible of Ice King's endeavors here, and some of their comments keep the scene consistently funny. Overall, it feels like it's just going to fade into one last Fionna and Cake story, but then comes the big twist of the episode, an elderly woman claiming to be Fionna, and before anybody has time to question this, she pops in a videotape. I'll get back to all of that in a second, but I first want to talk about the mini actual Fionna and Cake episode that's shown in this videotape. Now, in the actual episode, this plot is mixed with the main plot in order to create one episode, but just to simplify stuff, I'm gonna first talk about the actual Fionna and Cake tale in one go, and then talk about the other stuff later. Anyway, the story within the tape here is forced to be fairly simple because of time constraints, but I do like what we get here. There's no time for new character dynamics or anything like that, but the episode finds an interesting premise, such as who is the mummy, and then finds an undiscussed character for it to be, the Queen of Ooo. I love this episode fully embraces that Fionna and Cake can be kind of dumb just like Finn and Jake, and it all works to create a nice final little adventure for these guys in the background, while the chaos of the foreground occurs. Speaking of which, jumping back in the episode, the emergence of who I will call old Fionna in the library is immediately met with a strange reaction from Finn and Jake. While Finn is initially curious how a tape of a female version of him was obtained, he quickly just kind of gives up on it. And yeah, while I give this as funny, it's a bit of a stretch for plot convenience that he would just give up so quickly. Anyway, after some fairly funny interactions with Simon, the reveal that old Fionna is just somebody cosplaying the character after accidentally tuning into what appears to be a show with the characters in it definitely asks more questions than it answers. There is some really interesting commentary here about the dangers of identifying with a piece of media or a character, something that likely felt relatable to a large amount of people consuming this episode, but let's be real, what you guys want to hear me talk about is the implications of the giant beam that shoots Fionna and Cake into Ice King's brain at the end of this episode. And yeah, I really have no idea. There are a couple of possibilities that make sense, at least to me, and I guess that one of these has to be right. Option 1 is that Fionna and Cake is a real alternate dimension, and that these stories have been shot into a sleeping Ice King's brain, who has then penned them. Option 2 is that Fionna and Cake is a television show in a different dimension that just happens to mirror the inhabitants of Ooo, and that Simon again has just been copying them down. Option 3 is that the crown is turning Simon's creations into real life, but that doesn't really explain the beam going into his head and not the other way around. Option 4 is unfortunately the most likely, which is that it's some kind of weird Adventure Time space thing that the show never had the time to introduce. Overall though, it's a really weird place to take the characters if you didn't have the intention to resolve the plot, which the show chooses not to use one of its season 10 episodes to do so. I'll talk about how this episode relates to the spinoff more in a second, but just to summarize my thoughts on this episode, the actual Fionna and Cake subplot is fun, and there are some great jokes in this one, but some of the plot conveniences feel frustrating, and it's hard to comment on any of the plot stuff since I don't know where it was supposed to go.
Oh, Fionna, your fist has touched my heart.
So what has been the conclusion of watching all these episodes? It's that Fionna and Cake is a really fun concept, and that more shows should do something similar. And I'm not even talking about just gender-bent versions of the characters, I'm more talking about the pure novelty of seeing episodes with altered versions of the characters and doing plots that are otherwise impossible. Obviously, the quality varies from episode to episode, but I enjoyed at least bits and pieces of every one, and of course Bad Little Boy was fantastic to revisit. is it. I hope that going through these episodes has made you as excited and slightly worried for the spin-off as I am. Speaking of which, let's just talk about the spin-off for a second. If you're like me and have tried to gather all the information about it that you can, you'll be left with a lot of confusion. There's no information about how the show will relate to Fionna and Cake and Fiona. Finn's voice actor is in it somehow. The other gender-bent characters are teased, even though the plot summary of the first episode makes it seem like we're not even in gender-bent ooh. There's just a lot of conflicting information. Some of the crew is starting to roll off, which makes me believe that we're at least in post-production, so I would guess that a 2024 release is likely. As for what I want to see, I don't really know. What we can expect given the plot summary and the involvement of Simon is some kind of multiverse tale, which means that it's not really going to be anything like the Fionna and Cake that we just talked about. Either way, most of the crew is the same as the mostly fantastic Distant Land specials, so I have faith that whatever we get will be equally Adventure Timey good. Anyway, that's the video. Kind of a different style for the channel, but after doing so many single episode analysis videos to start off the year, as well as the mostly negative Pakatu Island one, I thought I could use a change of pace. Just as I've said in the last couple of these videos, I'm really trying to do a video every 2 weeks, at least through the first couple of months of the year, and I have a couple of slots empty. So if you have any ideas for an episode or a show I should cover, please leave it in the comments or find me on Twitter. Also, I'm writing this a little over a month before you guys will see this video, so 1, sorry if news has come out about Fionna and Cake that I'm not talking about, and 2, thank you guys so much for your support over the last few months. Anyway, I've rambled for way too long, so I'll end it here. This has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.